Hi, Acadiana. I'm meteorologist Dave Baker. Happy Thursday to you. Wow, it is a pretty day across Acadiana. Hard to believe that there's a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's a Category 2, and it is forecast to be a Category 3 hurricane at landfall, still on track to make its way toward the Florida Panhandle, somewhere around Apalachee Bay. The biggest city that's right on the coast is Apalachicola, that's close to this, and then the largest major city that's just inland would be Tallahassee. And we're going to take you to some of the webcams here in just a little bit. But first, I wanted to talk about how pretty it is here today. Actually, mostly sunny is our skies right now. We're looking at mostly sunny skies. It really is an absolutely beautiful day that's out there, and I think we're going to continue to see some gorgeous weather as we go into the early part of the afternoon with a lot of sunshine out there, and those temperatures are probably going to hover here in the mid 80s over the next several hours. Those winds are out of the north at 20, gusting at times up to 30 miles per hour. Part of that is because of Helene, and part of that is because of a strong trough of low pressure that pushed a good cold front through the area. So I wanted to start with the radar scope here with what we've got with Hurricane Helene, and it is now starting to show up on some of the radar imagery there coming out of Tampa. Even though there's not a whole lot of heavy rain that's coming on land, some of the storm surge values are starting to pick up across Charlotte Bay and then getting into Tampa Bay as well, and then areas all along the west coast of Florida are going to be impacted by storm surge, heavy rain, and tropical storm force winds are already working their way onto the Florida coast. Pretty skies again here in Lafayette and much of the Acadiana area, and if you've got to do some traveling or outside stuff to do today, it is going to be very, very pretty, and a lot of that is thanks to that deep trough that dug across the middle part of the country right through here, and that upper trough is what is responsible for pulling this particular hurricane and moving it northward over the Florida Panhandle, and unfortunately it's going to be wrapping around kind of a closed or a cutoff rather upper level low that's there over parts of the deep south, and it will eventually get absorbed in that. There's been some comments, is this going to rotate around and come all the way back into the Gulf of Mexico? That's not very likely. Low pressure here is probably going to absorb all of it, and eventually this will get kicked off toward the east as we head toward the latter part of the week. So we don't really have any worries except for maybe a few high thin clouds coming in over the next couple of days. Boating, not such a great day. Again, this is a combination of the cold front that came through and with Hurricane Helene off to the east. Helene's influence is going to be a little bit more on our southeastern waters, getting east of Morgan City and the Atchafalaya River. And then our western waters are going to be a little bit rough because of Helene out there, but the winds are going to be quite strong because of that cold front coming through. But wanted to show you some of the cams here. This is St. George Island. So this is just to the west of east of Apalachicola. So you're facing Apalachee Bay, and that's basically that Big Bend area of Florida. So this is an area that's going to be susceptible to do some serious storm surge. In fact, they're talking 15 to 20 foot storm surges in these areas. There's another shot there at St. George Island, which is just right off the Florida Panhandle coast. It's windy, it's rainy, and they're anticipating a Category 3 hurricane to be coming in later on. Panama City Beach is a little bit farther toward the west, and at this point, based on the track, it does appear that we're going to be seeing more of an offshore flow there. So hopefully storm surge won't be as big of an issue there in Panama City Beach, but they are going to be getting some pretty good winds because they're going to be very, very close to the eye of the hurricane. So this is what it looks like on the satellite imagery. Yesterday was still kind of broken up as it was moving right past the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula, but today it's gotten its act together a lot more, and it's still got a little bit of time to go, and it's over very warm waters with very high ocean heat content, and it's not being affected a lot by shear, but that upper trough that's off to the west is going to kind of pull it inland fairly quickly, so that forward speed might inhibit some of the development, but I still think it's got enough wiggle room to reach Category 3 at the very least by the time it reaches landfall. And there's another kind of look at that satellite imagery. So that very tip before you get into the Big Bend area that's off the coast of Florida, right about in here is where you've got Panama City, and then down to the south you've got Apalachicola. I know that is moving there, so it doesn't really make much difference. But you can see that latitude or that longitude line, so it's crossing over that. So now we really think that as it's going to continue a northeasterly direction, that the chances of making its way here into Apalachee Bay are pretty likely. And I will say that the computer models have been pretty much on top of each other when it comes to a track forecast. And track forecast is not necessarily as difficult as some of the intensity forecasts, the storm surge forecast, the inland wind forecast, and also the very heavy rain, the flooding forecast that we're going to be having. But all the players were really in place. The upper trough that's to our west, a ridge of high pressure to the east. So those were pretty solid features in the game of tracking this particular system. So that's why the hurricane models have pretty much stayed right on top of each other and really haven't moved a whole lot over the last several days. And that is the official cone from the National Hurricane Center. It is still forecast to be a major hurricane at landfall. I believe the winds are supposed to go up to maybe as high as 120 miles per hour. So that's a solid Category 3 hurricane. And as it continues to move inland, it still will be quite strong because of the forward movement that's going to be kind of picking up a little bit. It's already moving northeast at 14. But it is going to continue to accelerate as it moves inland. So that one will pull a lot more storm surge in, which is why we're looking at some big time storm surge values, but also look at the tropical storm force winds, how far inland they go. They've got hurricane warnings that are all the way up through about the mid part of Georgia, and then you've got some tropical storm warnings that are a little farther inland. So it isn't going to be just the coast, as we've been talking about. These inland winds are going to be quite strong. The storm surge, and then of course the flooding potential is going to be one of the biggest issues when it comes to Helene once it moves inland. And there is the storm surge forecast from the National Hurricane Center. 15, perhaps up to 20 feet in those areas that are shaded in purple, and then a little bit less as you go off toward the southwest. But even from Naples up to around Fort Myers, and then getting up to around Tampa, you're still going to be looking at some significant storm surge, perhaps 6 to 8 feet on the higher end of the scale, and they're not going to be taking a landfall. And in fact, they're going to be well over 100 miles away from the eye of the hurricane. But because of the way it's moving parallel to the coast, and then because it's also pushing so much water back up toward Florida, that continues to pile up. We see the same kind of issue here when a hurricane kind of drifts off toward the west and heads over toward Texas. As it passes Louisiana, it throws storm surge in, first to New Orleans, then to a Grand Isle, then over to around Atchafalaya Bay, Vermilion Bay, and so on and so on. So just like what we're seeing with what we would see in a westward type of a track of a hurricane here in Louisiana, because this one is kind of going up like that, it's going to throw a bunch of water here against the coastline of western Florida. So storm surge values are going to be quite high. There is your track forecast. Again, we're starting to split hairs when it comes to where it's going to make landfall because we're getting so close. So at this point, you're not going to see much of a wiggle more than maybe 20 miles, but the hurricane cone at 12 hours, I think, is 20 miles wide. And what that cone does is it takes into consideration the margin of error of all of the hurricane forecasts over the past 5 years. 66%, or 2/3 of those, will always stay within the cone of uncertainty, but you have 1/3 of them that can kind of go on the outside envelope of those cones. But it does closely follow what the hurricane guidance models are showing right there. And then the 3-day flood risk is going to be extreme, I think, here, stretching from the Florida Panhandle and then going on up through Georgia and even into the Carolinas. And the other problem is geography. You got the lowland there along the Gulf Coast there of the Big Bend region of Florida, which is very similar to what we have here in Louisiana. You don't have a lot of elevation gain as you go farther inland. So storm surge flooding is going to be pretty intense there, but it's the rain that's going to be coming in as well. And that's going to affect some of the bigger cities, Montgomery, Birmingham, Atlanta, Chattanooga, maybe even all the way up to Knoxville. Even Nashville could get some decent rains. But you're talking about level 3, level 4 in that orange and pink shade there. So that's a lot of rain, and there's a lot of population that's going to be dealing with that. And that's probably going to be one of the bigger news makers after it makes landfall. So as we get into Friday and Saturday, if you're checking in on some of the latest on Hurricane Helene, it's probably going to be focusing on a lot of flooding across the Peach State. Now there is a look at the anticipated rainfall there along the coast from Panama City eastward to around Tallahassee. Anywhere between 8 and 12 inches of rain. That lighter yellow shade is 4 to 6 inches of rain, which would include the Atlanta metro area. And then as you start to get into the Carolinas, the western part of the Carolinas, and into eastern Tennessee, you start to get into the Appalachian Mountains. So you've got the tropical air that's coming in at a very low elevation, and then it's forced upward. And once it gets forced upward, it has to basically let go of its moisture in order for it to rise. So that's why we're looking at maybe over a foot of rain over parts of the western Carolinas and then going into eastern parts of Tennessee. That, and because it will be slowing down once it starts to push inland and kind of wrap around that upper level low. Still concerned about the water temperatures and the high heat content, but again, as it's moving across there, it doesn't have too far to go before we make landfall here, probably within the next 8 to 10 hours. So as far as those wind, or as far as those water temperatures, they are extreme, but they haven't changed a whole lot. And we'll talk more about that in the extended forecast when we look beyond Helene and start to look at anything else that might be coming out. So here are the latest models that we have at landfall. And I'm going to note, I want you to pay attention kind of to the time frame. So this is the GFS model for 7 o'clock this evening, but you can see it's not quite to the coast yet. So we're probably talking about 9-ish, 10-ish a little bit later on, but this is a significant hurricane. It does have winds of over 75 or near 75 knots. So you're talking about 90-mile-per-hour winds there. So that's Category 1, almost a Category 2 hurricane. And this may be just after the peak of the intensity. There may be some weakening right before it makes landfall. And the Euro model, which was pretty much calling for a tropical storm quite a bit this week, is now upped it close more into hurricane mode. Still though, the Euro model, and it is a global model, but this is the hurricane specific part of the global model, and it is calling for a Category 1 there. But the hurricane models that basically just focus on hurricane. It's not thinking about the outside stuff that's out there except for where it might track. But when it comes to the intensity, the HWRF does seem to overblow it just a little bit, but you can see at least at the top scale there on the top, it's dropping that pressure to 935. And the winds there are at 112 knots. So I think that's getting up to about 130. So that would be pushing Category 4 at that point. And then the HAFS model also is very similar. Again, Thursday, notice that it is just offshore for Thursday, 7 p.m. With a 956 millibar and the winds there over 88 knots. So that's still at a Category 2. So you've got this one to GFS. It's got it just offshore at 7. The Euro model has it right on the coast at 10. And then also the HWRF has it on the coast by 10 o'clock this evening. And the HAFS model has it right there just offshore at 7 o'clock. So I think that 7 to 11 time frame this evening is probably when we're going to see the landfall of Hurricane Helene, and then it will continue to go ahead and move inland. So there's a lot of other stuff, believe it or not, to talk about that's out there. It's not just Helene, and throughout the week we've been kind of monitoring a bit of a disturbance out here, which we thought was going to be Tropical Storm Isaac. Well, last night, this little blip here instead got the designation of Tropical Storm Isaac beforehand. In fact, that one had a lower end chance of development yesterday, but it looks like they've figured out that this has got the tropical characteristics. But we're still watching this area right here, which does still have a high-end chance for development. And if it becomes a tropical storm, it'll get the next name on the list, which is Joyce. I did want to also point out this little area of moisture. It's a tropical wave that's kind of working westward into portions of the Caribbean Sea. Right now, the National Hurricane Center doesn't seem to be too interested in it, but farther down the road, as some of this moisture kind of works its way into the western part of the Caribbean. Remember we talked maybe late last week about the Central American Gyre, which is kind of a big low pressure area that kind of spins there, and you get these little disturbances that just kind of rotate around it, and that's basically where Helene came from. And if this continues to move off toward the west and fills this area here with moisture, there are some hints that we might have something trying to come around, at least a low pressure area kind of wrapping around that Central American gyre. And we might have another area of development, or at least possible development, over the western part of the Caribbean Sea going into about the next week to 10 days. So real quick, we'll go over Isaac. There it is, moving over the North Atlantic. Its winds are at 50 miles per hour. It is forecast to be a hurricane, but this one's going to stay out in the open waters of the Atlantic Ocean and shouldn't bother anybody. So getting back to the models, you can see on the GFS, you can see how Helene moves inland, kind of meanders around the Appalachians, and eventually gets kicked out by an upper trough. But if you see there in those ladder frames, right there over the Bay of Campeche in the western part of the Caribbean Sea, and we'll let it roll one more time, but you see the moisture moving across the western part of the Caribbean, and eventually there's a low pressure area there and maybe a tropical system trying to develop its way into the Bay of Campeche going into the first week of October. The Euro model also, as we watch Helene kind of move away, it kind of gets wrapped up there in the mid part of the country and will kick away eventually. Not really seeing as much definitive low pressure here over parts of the Bay of Campeche or the Western Caribbean with the Euro, but there is a little bit of a low pressure area there, and there's a decent amount of moisture, and you can also see there's a couple of other areas that are out in the Atlantic Ocean that might be needed to be watched here over the next week to 10 days. And then on top of that, the Canadian is continuing to have something develop, just like the GFS here, coming in about October 5th. This is October 6th, and then by October 7th-ish, you've got something that may be coming on to the eastern part of the Gulf of Mexico. It looks a little confusing because the last frame of that right there, and then it starts, boom, with where Helene is right now. So that does get a little bit confusing, but two different systems, and you got some other stuff that's out here once again that we'll just kind of keep an eye on. But it does appear that things could be a little bit busier going into the next couple of weeks. As Helene is going away, we'll probably take a breather here for about 4 or 5 days, and then we'll have to start watching whatever comes down to the south. Even the Icon model has at least a bit of a weak low pressure area trying to develop here over the Bay of Campeche. So 3 out of the 4 models really are, and really I could say 4 out of the 4 models, even though the Euro doesn't seem very impressed by it, there's still a little bit of a general low pressure area out there going into the first week of October. But for the next 7 days, Helene will go ahead and make landfall. Isaac will probably become a hurricane over the northern Atlantic Ocean and push eastward. No worries there. And then the blip that you see there in the middle part of the Atlantic, if it gets a name, that would become Tropical Storm Joyce. And then the next name on the list is Kirk. And I don't have my list with me. I can't remember which one it is. I already told you earlier that, yeah, I have to apologize in advance that sometimes I've called Helene, Hermine, and Francine. It's like fussing at my kids. I never get the name right the first time around. So there's a lot that could be happening, and we talk about this global tropical hazards outlook. So this is going out for the next 7 days. And the top graphic here is days 7 through 14, and then the bottom graphic is days 14 through 21. And I know when we get out to 3 weeks, that's pretty much la-la land, but it is indicating maybe a higher chance for some development here in week 2 over parts of the Western Caribbean and the Bay of Campeche, but it also looks like it might be staying kind of hot there for the following week. So there's the possibility we could see a few more named storms coming in. We need to get to 14 just to make it to a normal season. And I know all the early season forecasts were going for way above normal, but we've only got like 5 more, I think 5 more systems to go. And then we will be at a normal season. And kind of based on some of the models I'm looking at, 2 or 3 named storms somewhere out in the Atlantic Basin doesn't seem to be that far-fetched. So we'll watch the Global Tropical Hazards Outlook. This updates once a week. We're going to get another update next Tuesday afternoon after Let's Talk Tropics. So we'll have the new one coming up for you there a week from Wednesday. And again, October, it still can be a busy month. And here in Louisiana, we've had our fair share of October systems, but do notice that the areas of development tend to be more in the Gulf of Mexico, the Western Caribbean, and then they track out into the Atlantic Ocean. And a lot of that is that Central American gyre that is kind of around here in this area area during the month of June, and then it kind of falls apart. And then toward the end of the hurricane season in October and November, it kind of kicks up again. And that's why we focus more in these areas here when it comes to tropical development at the beginning and toward the end of the hurricane season. So don't let your guard down yet. I know we had a near miss for most of us here in Acadiana with Francine. And I know there were a lot of folks that were kind of picking up some extra supplies over the course of the weekend, because I went out and did a little shopping for some basic things. Not really for hurricane preparedness. I just run out of stuff sometimes, but I just noticed it was very, very busy and people were still trying to stock up on a couple of things. So we've had 2 misses so far here in the Acadiana region. So hopefully everybody has the things they need just in case something else comes along, because hurricane season doesn't end until November the 30th. Well, that's what I got for you here on this Thursday. If you like this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and also turn on those notifications. And in between these broadcasts, make sure you follow my Facebook and my page over at X, which is at Dave Baker TV. I'm meteorologist Dave Baker. I hope you enjoy this gorgeous Thursday. Get out and get some sunshine. I will see you tomorrow morning for Acadiana Weather Today at 7:30.